The story of World War II is typically told through the lens of the frozen Eastern Front, the bombed-out cities of Europe, or the suffocating jungles of the Pacific. But there was another theater, a battlefield defined not by terrain or infrastructure, but by sheer, overwhelming emptiness. This was the North African Campaign, a war fought in a furnace under a relentless sun, a conflict where the enemy was not just the soldier across the sand, but the sand itself. It was a campaign of vast distances, spectral armies that appeared and vanished in the heat haze, and a brutal, elemental struggle for survival. This is the story of the desert ghosts, the men, the machines, and the myths forged in the most unforgiving landscape on Earth. The strategic importance of North Africa was clear on a map, but the maps themselves were liars. For the British Empire, it was about protecting the Suez Canal, the imperial artery that connected the United Kingdom to the oil of the Middle East and the resources of India and Asia. Its loss would have strangled the British war effort. For the Axis, it was a chance to deliver a knockout blow to a weakened Britain, secure access to Middle Eastern oil, and link up with their forces in the Caucasus, creating a nightmarish continental pincer. But the neat lines on the staff officers' charts bore little resemblance to the reality on the ground. This was not a war for cities or rivers. It was a war for barren, empty space, a handful of dusty coastal ports, and the tracks that connected them. The first and most formidable ghost was the desert itself. The Sahara is a continent within a continent, a place of profound and ancient indifference. For soldiers arriving from the green fields of England, the damp forests of Germany, or the rolling hills of Italy, it was a psychological and physical shock from which many never recovered. The heat was a physical blow. By day, temperatures could soar to 120 Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius, a dry, baking oven that made metal too hot to touch and induced a lethargy that sapped the will. At night, it could plunge to near freezing, the clear desert sky radiating all the day's heat away, leaving men shivering in their thin uniforms. Then there was the sand, fine, abrasive, and utterly inescapable. It gritted in their teeth, fouled their bully beef and hardtack, clogged the delicate mechanisms of their rifles and machine guns, and infiltrated the finely tuned engines of their tanks and trucks. A vehicle's air filter was its lifeline. Without constant, back-breaking maintenance, the engine would choke to death on the very ground it traversed. Water was a currency more precious than gold. The daily ration was strictly measured, a meager amount for drinking, a little for cooking, and, if one was exceptionally lucky, a few precious spoonfuls for a shave to maintain a semblance of humanity. Personal hygiene was a distant memory. Sores, desert sores, and dysentery were rampant. And then came the Khamsin, the desert sandstorm. It would announce itself as a faint brownish haze on the horizon, growing until it blotted out the sun. The wind would howl, carrying billions of stinging sand particles that reduced visibility to zero, halted armies in their tracks, and could strip the paint from vehicles. A Khamsin could last for days, a suffocating, maddening ordeal that left men and machines buried and disoriented. This was not a passive backdrop to the war. The desert was an active, malevolent participant, a third army that fought against both sides with impartial fury. Into this arena of elemental hardship stepped two opposing forces, each forced to adapt its doctrine and its very soul to survive. On the Axis side was the legendary Deutsches Afrika Korps, DAK, under the command of a general whose name would become synonymous with desert warfare, Erwin Rommel. Arriving in February 1941 to bail out his faltering Italian allies, Rommel was a force of nature, energetic, bold to the point of recklessness, and possessed of an almost uncanny ability to read the tactical flow of a battle. He immediately grasped the central truth of desert warfare. In a land with no front lines, mobility was everything. The vast, trackless expanse was not a barrier, but a highway for those who dared to use it. Rommel's tactics, from the very beginning, earned his men the nickname the desert ghosts from their bewildered British opponents. Ignoring orders to remain on the defensive, he launched a lightning offensive in March 1941. His panzer divisions, a mix of the sturdy Panzer III and IV tanks, seemed to materialize out of the heat haze where the British High Command was certain no army could travel or be supplied. He used the desert's emptiness to mask his movements, launching feints and daring flanking maneuvers that left larger, more static British forces surrounded, confused, and defeated. The myth of the Desert Fox was born, a phantom commander who seemed to be everywhere at once, a master of the blitzkrieg adapted for the sands. The Siege of Tobruk in 1941 exemplified this new form of warfare. While the main British force was pushed back into Egypt, the Allied garrison in the port of Tobruk held out, a thorn in Rommel's supply line. The ensuing siege was a brutal 8-month battle of attrition, with the Royal Navy running a gauntlet of air attacks to supply the defenders. The defenders, a mixed force of Australians, British, Indian, and Polish troops, became known as the Rats of Tobruk, a name they wore with pride. They endured relentless artillery barrages and infantry assaults, their defiance becoming a symbol of Allied resistance and proving that Rommel's ghost army could be pinned down. The pinnacle of Rommel's tactical genius came at the Battle of Gazala in May-June 1942. The British had constructed a formidable line of fortified boxes protected by vast minefields. Rommel's response was a masterstroke. Instead of a frontal assault, he led the bulk of his armor on a daring, wide flanking maneuver around the southern end of the Gazala line, a march through the deep desert that the British considered impossible for a large force. He swung north, aiming to crush the British armor from behind. What followed was a chaotic, swirling armored battle in an area known as the Cauldron. Rommel's forces, though often outnumbered and perilously low on fuel, fought with ferocious skill. They used the British minefields as a shield for their own defenses and defeated the British armored brigades piecemeal as they counterattacked in an uncoordinated fashion. The victory at Gazala led to the fall of Tobruk, a devastating blow that sent shockwaves to London and earned Rommel his field marshal's baton. His ghost army was at the gates of Egypt. But the British were not without their own phantoms. If Rommel and the Afrika Korps were the ghosts of the front lines, the British created phantoms of the deep desert, shadows that struck from the void. The first and most enduring of these was the Long-Range Desert Group, LRDG, founded by Major Ralph Bagnold, a pre-war explorer who had already crossed and mapped vast, impassable sections of the Sahara. The LRDG was not a conventional fighting unit. They were the eyes and ears of the 8th Army, composed initially of New Zealand farmers, men whose practical ingenuity and experience with harsh, open spaces made them ideal for the task. The LRDG later included Rhodesians and British Guardsmen. The LRDG's mission was strategic reconnaissance. They mastered the art of desert survival, modifying their Chevrolet 30 kilowatts and Ford F8 trucks by stripping them down and adding extra fuel tanks, water condensers, sun compasses, and machine guns for self-defense. A single patrol could last for weeks, covering thousands of miles behind enemy lines. They would establish hidden observation posts, OPs, on escarpments overlooking the Axis coastal supply route, the Via Balbia. For days on end, they would lie motionless in the blistering heat, meticulously counting and identifying every truck, tank, and aircraft that passed below, radioing this priceless intelligence back to headquarters. They were navigational wizards, using the sun compass, an instrument Bagnold had helped develop, to find their way across a featureless sea of sand with no landmarks. To the Italian and German sentries, they were a whispered legend, rumors of bearded, sun-blackened men who moved like jinns and left no trace. Where the LRDG was the Scout, the Special Air Service, SAS, was the Dagger. Founded by the unorthodox, ruthless, and visionary David Sterling, the SAS was built on a simple, brutal premise. The most vulnerable point for the Axis was their air power, and their airfields were strung out along the coast, seemingly safe in the rear. Sterling's genius was to realize that the deep desert, which the enemy considered a safe flank, could be used as a highway for attack. In their early days, the SAS was a makeshift affair. They used the LRDG as their desert taxi service. The LRDG would drive them on a multi-day journey to a drop-off point near a target airfield. Under the cover of pitch darkness, SAS teams, often no more than a handful of men, would approach on foot. Armed with Lewis bombs, a homemade explosive concoction of plastic explosive, thermite, and kerosene, they would creep onto the heavily guarded airfields. With silent efficiency, they would place their bombs on the cockpits and fuel lines of enemy aircraft, set timers for a simultaneous explosion, and then melt back into the desert to their LRDG pickup point. The results were devastating. In a single raid on the airfields of Tamat and Sirte in December 1941, the SAS destroyed over 60 aircraft and numerous fuel and supply dumps without a single casualty. The SAS became a phantom plague, striking at will and vanishing without a trace. Their existence was so secret that, for a long time, the German High Command believed the damage was caused by sophisticated internal sabotage or bored sentries accidentally discharging their weapons. The psychological impact was immense, forcing the Axis to divert thousands of troops from the front lines to guard their rear areas. The desert was no longer safe. This war of ghosts and phantoms, of deep reconnaissance and daring sabotage, set the stage for the climactic confrontation of the campaign. By the summer of 1942, Rommel's Afrika Korps stood at the tiny Egyptian railway halt of El Alamein. Just 60 miles of desert lay between his forces in the Nile Delta, Alexandria, and the Suez Canal. But here, the desert itself conspired against him. The Qattara Depression to the south, a vast, impassable salt marsh, pinched the battlefield into a narrow corridor. There was no room to flank. The ghosts had been funneled into a killing ground. The First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942 was a brutal, grinding affair. The British, now commanded by General Claude Auchinleck, managed to halt Rommel's final, exhausted advance. It was a battle of desperate counterattacks and dogged defense that bled the Afrika Korps white and proved, for the first time, that the Desert Fox could be stopped and beaten. But it was the Second Battle of El Alamein, beginning on October 23, 1942, that truly broke the back of the Axis in Africa. Commanded by the meticulous, confident, and media-savvy General Bernard Montgomery, the British Eighth Army had been transformed. It was now a massive, well-equipped force supplied with the new American Sherman tank, which outgunned Rommel's panzers. Montgomery understood he could not outghost Rommel in a war of maneuver at El Alamein. Instead, he would use overwhelming, methodical force in a set-piece battle of attrition. The opening artillery barrage was one of the most concentrated of the entire war. At 9:40 p.m., over 800 guns erupted in a unified roar, a thunderous curtain of fire that lit up the night sky and announced the end of the Phantom War. It was the beginning of a sledgehammer blow. What followed was 12 days of brutal, close-quarters fighting. Montgomery's plan, Operation Lightfoot, was a massive infantry assault to clear paths through the deep German minefields, the Devil's Gardens, so the armor could follow. The fighting was savage. Positions like Kidney Ridge and Snipe became killing zones, with anti-tank gunners and tank crews dueling at point-blank range. Rommel, who had been away on sick leave in Germany, rushed back but found his forces starved of fuel and ammunition, thanks to Allied air and naval supremacy and the relentless harassment of their supply lines by the real desert ghosts, the LRDG and SAS. He could not maneuver. He could only stand and fight. On November 2nd, With Operation Supercharge, the British 9th Armoured Brigade launched a near-suicidal dawn charge against the German anti-tank gun line, sacrificing itself to create a breach. The 1st and 10th Armored Divisions poured through. The end was near. Realizing annihilation was imminent, Rommel, against Hitler's direct stand-and-die order, began a masterful fighting retreat. The Ghost Army was now a visible broken force, streaming back across the desert it had once dominated. The chase was on, a final grueling race west across Libya and into Tunisia. The desert, once their ally, had one last role to play. It became a graveyard. The roadside was littered with the skeletons of panzers, trucks, and aircraft, abandoned out of fuel, or destroyed by relentless Allied air attacks. The men who had once moved like phantoms were now prisoners of war, their spirit broken, or casualties left behind in the anonymous sand. The final act played out in the hills of Tunisia. Rommel, after a last failed gamble at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, where his veterans handed a sharp defeat to the inexperienced US II Corps, was recalled to Germany. The Axis forces in Africa, now trapped between Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from the east and the newly formed Anglo-American 1st Army from the west, were squeezed into a collapsing pocket. On May 13, 1943, the last remnants of the Afrika Korps and the Italian Army surrendered. Over 275,000 prisoners were taken. The Desert Fox had been run to ground. The Ghosts had been exorcised. The legacy of the Desert Ghosts endures far beyond the sands of North Africa. The campaign was a brutal, formative crucible. It was here that the American Army received its first bloody lesson in modern warfare at Kasserine Pass, a defeat that led to swift, necessary reforms in command and tactics. It was here that the British 8th Army, forged in defeat and humiliation, transformed into a confident, combined arms force that would later prove itself in Sicily and Italy. But the most profound and lasting legacy lies with the Special Forces. The LRDG and the SAS revolutionized modern warfare. They proved that a small number of highly trained, audacious, and independent-thinking soldiers, operating with strategic independence, could achieve an impact out of all proportion to their numbers. They wrote the manual on long-range reconnaissance, deep penetration, precision sabotage, and survival behind enemy lines, a manual that remains the foundation for special operations doctrine worldwide. They were the original Ghosts, and their spirit lives on in every modern Special Forces unit, from the British SAS and SBS to the American Delta Force and Navy SEALs. Today, the Sahara remains vast and silent. The wind has long since smoothed over the tank tracks and footprints. The battles are a fading memory in history books, but the Ghosts are still there. If you know where to look, you can find them. The hulks of Panzer IVs and M3 Grant tanks lie half-buried in the sand, their steel skins rusted to a deep, burnt orange, their interiors home to nothing but scorpions and the wind. They are silent, skeletal monuments to the men, German, British, Italian, Australian, New Zealander, Indian, South African, and American, who fought, suffered, and died in this beautiful, terrible place. They are a permanent reminder of a unique and savage conflict, a war of endurance, cunning, and spectral armies clashing in the endless silent sands, where the greatest victory was not just over an enemy, but over the desert itself.